Hello everyone, how are you guys? I am so sorry that this has been a long time in the coming, but I've been working on your classes for the Principles and Methods of Teaching course, and it's one of my favorite courses. I have done it a couple of times now, and it talks a lot about teaching and how we're supposed to teach. So this is the Principles and Methods of Teaching class that we're going to do, and we're going to start with the idea of teaching and the purpose of teaching. I know I have given you a note on this, and I know I have asked you to read Howard Hendricks' book, and I think that's where I want to start. So the first place I would like to start as anyone is going to be the definition of what teaching is. So when you think of teaching, what comes to your mind? If you're actually listening to this video, I would request you to write a definition of what you think teaching is supposed to mean. How do you define teaching? How do you understand teaching? How do you make sure that somebody is learning through the system that you are progressively going through with a pupil? So we all teach at the church, or we teach at the school, or we teach in a Bible school, or any place. So the question here is not, are we teaching just because we're teaching, or are we teaching because we need to teach, because we need to define the idea of what teaching is before we understand the purpose or the meaning. I'm sorry, we understand the purpose or the means of teaching. እንዴት ማስተማር እንዳለብን ምን ማስተማር እንዳለብን ለምን እንደማስተማር እንዳለብን ከማሰባችን በፊት we have to clearly define and identify the meaning of what teaching is. So my question for you would be, what does teaching mean? How do you define teaching? What makes teaching a particular element within your entire teaching learning progress? And I think one of the main ways we know that somebody is teaching or that we're teaching people is if we know if people have been taught. So the simple question is, how do you know people have been taught something? How do I know when I'm giving you this particular course that you are learning the things that I would like for you to learn? How do you know somebody has been taught the material you want to teach? So you can see a clear link between teaching and learning. There needs to be a very clear link between teaching and learning. Unless we have teaching, we cannot have learning. And in order to have learning, we need to have teaching existing. So basically, we go to the question of where does it begin and where does it end? So if you look at the picture that I gave you here, the entire idea of teaching goes throughout the circles. It's all about modifying someone, transitioning someone, transforming someone, shifting someone, adjusting. At the end of the day, the main thing that you ought to do is to change someone. So whenever we talk about teaching, teaching is not necessarily passing on information. አንዳንድ ጊዜ ማስተማር ምንድን ነው ስንባል የምናውቀውን ነገር ማስተላለፍ እንላለን፣ or ደግሞ የሰማነውን ኢንፎርሜሽን መናገር እንላለን. But teaching is quite different from that. Teaching is all about transferring. Teaching is not all about transferring information, but it's about bringing change in the student. And I'll show you how with the next few slides. So some definitions I would provide you for this class about teaching could be, teaching is about intended behavior for which the aim is to induce learning. So the idea is teaching is a behavior. So educationally, behavior does not necessarily mean bahari, but rather it means an action, a mind thing, an action and an attitude that you have about something to bring about difference. So these are the three words I would like for you to consider all the time as we go through the principles and methods of teaching. That would be the head, the heart, and the hand, as we call it at ETC, or you can call it cognitive, conative, and psychomotor, as you call it within the educational circle. So the cognitive, the conative, the attitude, and the conative, the work that you do on your hand, are the most important things that you do. And that is the intended behavior you have. And you have this behavior in order to induce learning. Unless learning is induced, then the intended behavior has not been done. So in order for learning to happen, we need to continually have the intended behavior that is causing this idea of learning. And teaching is aimed at changing the ways in which other person can or will behave. Again, it's about changing the mind, it's about changing the attitude, and it's about changing the skill or the psychomotor activity a person has. So it's not about transferring information. It's not feeding people an idea. It's not about telling them what to do and what not to do. It's entirely about helping them change their mind, change their attitude, and change their psychomotor skills. Unless those are happening, then we don't say learning is happening. So it's a very important thing. And teaching involves implementing strategies that are designed to lead learners to attain certain goals. So in all the three definitions, we find three common things. One, teaching, and teaching is all about learning, and learning is all about change. So it's a very simple causation relationship between each. So all we have to consider is that when we think of teaching, teaching necessarily should result in the happening of change. Unless change is observed in the learner, unless change is observed in the student, unless a particular thing within the student is changed, then we cannot say teaching has happened. I know you might have questions when it comes to this idea, because this is a suggestion that says ተማሪዎቹ ካልተለወጡ በተማሪዎቹ ህይወት ውስጥ ለውጥ ካላየን ትራንስፎርሜሽን ካላየን እንግዲህ ያው ትምህርት አላስተማርንም ማለት ነው። አንድ መምህር ክፍል ውስጥ ገብቶ ሊያወራ ይችላል። አንድ ሰባኪ መድረክ ላይ ቆሞ ሊያስተምር ይችላል። አንድ ሰው ክፍል ውስጥ ገብቶ ተማሪዎችን በሰብስቦ ሊናገር ይችላል። እግዚአብሔርን ቃል ሊሆን ይችላል የሚያወራው፣ በእግዚአብሔር መንፈስ ተመርቶ ነው የሚያወራው በቤተክርስቲያን ውስጥ የሚያስተምር ከሆነ። ነገር ግን የሰውዬ አስተማረ የሚባልበት ብቸኛ መንገድ የሚያስተምራቸው ሰዎች ህይወት ውስጥ ለውጥ ከመጣ ብቻ ነው። Unless change is happening, then teaching is not happening. So we can simply actually say that teaching, which I'll come to this definition በኋላ ላይ, is causing change. So this is the main definition that I will be going with. Teaching is all about causing change. Unless change has happened, then learning has not happened. Teaching is all about causing change. Teaching is about causing learning. Unless learning has happened, then teaching has not happened. And we can see this biblically. It's not የሆነ ጊዜ ላይ የመጣ idea. It's a very biblical idea. So if you can look at this, one of the main things you'd be able to look at is this. So when you look at the teacher has not taught until the student has learned, one of the main ways I'll bring it is through Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 1 and Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 1. Let me go out of the shared screen. So for teaching to happen, learning should happen. So if you read Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 1 and chapter 5 verse 1, which I'm going to read for you from my ASV version Bible, they both have the instructions, and I would advise you to go there and read it. Deuteronomy is one of the main books that we use whenever we teach or whenever we talk about biblical teaching. So Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 1 reads as such. And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them, that you may live and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your father, is giving you. So chapter 4 verse 1 says, think of the laws I am teaching you. Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you. So God is saying, I am teaching you these laws. But how do we know that you have learned? How do I know that I've learned? If you go to the immediate next chapter, chapter 5, verse 1 says, and Moses summoned all of Israel and said to them, hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them. So the idea is Moses, in chapter 4, verse 1, God is saying, I am teaching you these verses. And in chapter 5, verse 1, Moses is saying, you ought to learn this verses, the statutes and laws. Now, the verb used here is exactly the same word. The word used for teaching and the word used for learning are exactly the same. So we need to consider that the idea of teaching and the idea of learning are the same thing. The idea of teaching and the idea of learning use the same verb or the same word within the Hebrew Bible, indicating that when someone is teaching, the pupil, the students are learning. As እግዚአብሔር የማስተምራችሁን ሕግና ትእዛዝ ብሎ ምዕራፍ 5 ቁጥር 1 ላይ ደግሞ ይህንን ሕግ ትማሩት ዘንድ ሲል, it's the same word የምንጠቀመው. Basically saying teaching and learning are the same flips of the same sides of a coin. If teaching is not there, learning will not happen. And learning is not there unless teaching is there. As it's እናስተምር, the question we should ask is not how much do I know as a teacher. The first question should not be how much information am I giving. The first question should not be how much information am I transferring. The most basic thing we should be able to ask whenever we teach is, are my students learning? Is learning happening? Unless learning is happening, then teaching is happening, teaching is not happening. You need to have learning to happen in order to have teaching to happen. So hopefully you'd have questions for this. I would expect you to write up your questions on the discussion board, as I'll be uploading this on the note. But I would really like you to think about this. Whenever we think of teaching, do we immediately think of learning? እያስተማርን ነው ብለን ስናወራ የተማሪውን መማር ሁልጊዜ እያሰብን ነው ወይ? እያስተማርን ነው ብለን ስናወራ የተማሪውን መማር ሁልጊዜ ኮንሲደር እያደረግን ነው ወይ? Should be the main question we should ask. Now, as we said, teaching is causing change ብለናል። Teaching is all about the causation of change. And biblical teaching, ምን አይነት cause ነው change ማድረግ ሳይለበት ስንል, it's all about transformation. If teaching is causing learning, then teaching is simply an idea that says, then we need to cause transformation within the biblical life of people. Why would do that? This is Mohandas Gandhi, the famous Indian guy who did a very silent, rebellious thing. And this is a quotation he said, which really strikes me a lot. And I would post it on the discussion board for you to comment on it. I like your Christ. I don't like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. And I think that's something to think about. He said, I like your Christ. Whatever I hear about him, whatever I listen about him, whatever I hear about Christ, I love. The problem I have is with your Christians, because the Christ I know and the Christians that you have are entirely different. Christ and Christians do not look alike. And that is the issue of biblical teaching, because the command is not to understand what he's teaching. The command is not to know what he's teaching alone. The command is to actually imitate Christ. And this is the place where I'm going to show you the idea of transformation. Because biblical teaching is all about transformation. Biblical teaching is all about change, bringing about change. Unless change is happening, then we're not teaching. So to what kind of change should we teach? Like the butterfly that comes out of the ugly caterpillar, the ugly human side of us is supposed to change into the image of Christ. And that is very, very much indicated within this scripture. Now, doing a discourse analysis on the verse, Matthew chapter 28, verse 19 to 20, one of the main questions I ask all my students when I get them is, what's the command here? What's the command on Matthew 28? Because we focus so much on the going. ማቴዎስ 28 ላይ ያለው ታላቁ ተልእኮ ምንድነው ብለን ስናወራ ሁልጊዜ ሂዱ የሚል ሐሳብ እናነሳለን። But the question should be, is that the command of Christ? Because the command is not hidu. The mehed, as you are going, is a tool. It's not the command. The command is you, disciples of Jesus, disciple nations. እናንተ አሕዛብን ሕዝብን ደቀ መዝሙር አድርጉ የሚለው is the command of the verse. The Great Commission is you disciple nations. So the question is, how do we disciple the nations? If the Great Commission that Christ have given us at the end of his ministry is you disciple nations, then the question should be, oh Jesus, so how do we do it? How do we make disciples? It's you disciple nations. Where? As you are going. And the proper, looking at it from the Greek, this proper interpretation would be, as you are going about in your daily life. If you are an accountant in your accounting firm, if you're a doctor in your hospital, if you are a manager in the organization you're managing, if you're a teacher in your classroom, if you're a driver as you're driving a taxi, if you're a full-time minister as you're doing full-time in the church. But if you're a husband, as you're living as a husband, if you're a child, as you're living as a child, if you're a wife, as a spouse of a husband, either way, as you are going about your life, in that path, then make sure that you have one commission I give you. It's to make disciples. So husbands, make disciples of your wife. Parents, make disciples of your children. Managers, make disciples of your employees. Doctors, make disciples of your colleagues and others. Anyone in the path that you have in your life, as you are going, in every path of your life, you ought to make disciples. That is the commission. So the question is, how do we make them? One, make sure that you baptize them. Let them share in this eternal life that Christ has prepared for them, because that's what we learn about baptism later in the epistles of Paul. It's about dying for the world and rising up with Jesus. It's a symbolism where we show our allegiance to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're saying, as he has died, we die for this world and ourselves, and we rose up again in the life Christ has given us. So tell them this good news. Tell them, በበደላችሁና በኃጢአታችሁ ሙታን በነበራችሁበት በዛ ሰዓት ላይ እግዚአብሔር በምሕረቱ ባለጠጋ ስለሆነ ሕይወትን ሰጥቷችኋል። የሰጣችሁ ሕይወት ደግሞ የክርስቶስ ሕይወት ነች። So in baptism, show your allegiance to this salvation, and then teach them. Two commission. Baptize and teach. Where? As you're going in your daily lives. Teach. What are you supposed to teach them? To observe, to follow, to do in their life, to daily practice what? The things that I have commanded you. All the things that I have commanded you. So breaking down the Great Commission, we do not find a Great Commission that says just go, 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 go. It's all about make disciples of the nation. Transform nations to the image of Christ. Make them look like Christ. Do not just primarily move about and move into the life of that you want, but rather make them disciples of the nations. Now, what's our primary responsibility? Making disciples. And what does making disciples means? Teaching them to obey everything that Christ has commanded. So it's not about teaching them the church sirasraat. It's not about indoctrinating them. Biblical teaching, the Great Commission is not indoctrination. The Great Commission is transformation. It does not say teach them what your denomination is doing, whatever. It's about making them look like the image of Christ. And we get this throughout the entire New Testament. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Our life is not a stagnant life. When we learn about Christ, we're not stagnant. We are daily transforming into the glory of Christ. We are daily transforming into the glory of Jesus. We're daily transforming into the glory of Christ. And that transformation is about the image of Christ being formed in us. I'd like to show you another verse. Our every thought, decision, and experience move us closer to Christ and closer and farther to the world. That's how transformation should happen. But the idea is when we learn, we're either moving to the world or to Christ. So the question is, are we being transformed to Christ? Are we continually moving back to Christ? And we need to question ourselves but those who are controlled by the Holy Spirit think about the things that please the Spirit. It's all about focusing on the cross and being transformed into the image of Christ. It's all about making sure that Christ is supreme in our thought, and Christ is supreme in our heart, and Christ is supreme in our action. Head, heart, hand transformation brings a holistic transformation to the world. So we need to consider this verse. But if you refuse to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Would you prefer the gods of your ancestors, served beyond the Euphrates, or will you be the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live? But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. This is one of the last benedictions given by Joshua, the leader of Israel who got them into the land. He's saying, choose who you serve today. Are you going to serve Christ? Are you going to serve God? Or are you going to serve the other gods? Choose today. Be transformed through biblical understanding. And there are a couple of verses here that I have given you from Jeremiah and from Luke. And I would advise you just to go through these verses and start thinking about the idea of transformation. Because when we look at teaching is about change. And we need to consider that transformation is not on the outside primarily, but rather transformation is about what should be happening on the inside. It's all about the head, the heart. And the transformation of the head brings the transformation of the heart, and it brings the transformation of the hands, the life. So we need to understand that whenever we think about teaching is about a work of the heart. It's about transforming what's on the inside rather than what's on the outside. It's all about the transformation of the desire and the power, the desires and the attitudes within us. And that only comes from the Lord, because he gives us both the desire and the power to actually change into who we are. So as I close this session, what I would like for us to start thinking about is transformation. And I'd like for us, and I'm going to read for you from Galatians chapter 4, verse 19, which is one of my favorite verses of all time. And I'll put that up for our discussion. But Galatians chapter 4, verse 19 reads as such. My little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you. I am again in anguish. ልጆቼ ሆይ ዳግም ስለናንተ ክርስቶስ በእናንተ እስኪሳል ድረስ ዳግም ስለናንተ ምጥ ይዞኛል ይላል። I am in anguish. I am in childbirth agony so that I can see Christ formed in you. It's not about transferring information. It's not about indoctrination. Like I said, it has nothing to do with just information. Teaching is entirely about causing change. So how do we understand teaching further is what we're going to do next. I hope to see you all on the discussion board, because I'm going to post a couple of verses there, and I'd like to read your interpretations and reflections on those verses. Have a very good week.